Robert Thompson sat in the fourth row of the Oprah Winfrey Show audience, his massive hands folded carefully in his lap, trying to make himself smaller in a way that seemed impossible for a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches and had spent 30 years running toward danger when everyone else ran away. At 55 years old, his body bore the evidence of 3 decades as a Chicago Fire Department captain, scars from burns that had healed but never quite faded, a slight limp from when a ceiling beam had crushed his left leg and eyes that held the weight of every emergency call that had ended with someone going home to their family. But none of those physical marks compared to the one that couldn't be seen, the one that had been carved into his soul 4 years ago, when he learned that being a hero to thousands of strangers meant nothing if you couldn't save the one person who mattered most. The letter he had written to Oprah 6 weeks ago had taken him 3 months to finish. How do you explain to someone that you've spent your entire adult life saving lives, that you've pulled children from burning buildings, and performed CPR on grandmothers, and carried unconscious men down ladder trucks, but when your own 17-year-old son needed saving, you were 12 miles away at another emergency call? Today's show theme was Everyday Heroes, and Oprah was celebrating first responders, people who dedicated their lives to protecting and serving their communities. Robert had been invited as part of the audience after the show's producers had been moved by his letter, but he wasn't supposed to be a featured guest. He was just supposed to sit there and listen to other people's stories of heroism, to find some comfort in being around others who understood the weight of carrying other people's safety on their shoulders. But as Oprah moved through the audience, sharing stories of courage and sacrifice, Robert felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever people talked about heroism in his presence. Because how can you be a hero when you failed at the most important moment? How can you accept praise for saving strangers when you couldn't save your own child? The moment that changed everything came when Oprah asked the audience a question that seemed to slice straight through to Robert's deepest pain. How many of you have ever felt like you let down the people who counted on you most? Robert's hand went up before he could stop himself. Around him, other hands were raised too, but something about the anguish in Robert's posture, the way his broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, caught Oprah's attention immediately. She walked over to his row with that intuitive grace that had made her America's most trusted voice for decades, understanding somehow that this man's story needed to be heard. "What's your name, honey?" Oprah asked, sitting down in the chair that a stagehand had quickly brought over, sensing that this conversation would need time and space to unfold properly. "Robert Thompson," he replied, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent years giving clear, calm instructions in crisis situations. "I'm a captain with the Chicago Fire Department. 30 years of service." 30 years, Oprah repeated, and something in her voice suggested she understood that this number represented more than just time served. "That's a lot of lives touched, a lot of families helped." Robert nodded, but his expression didn't carry the pride that should have accompanied such an acknowledgement. "Yes, ma'am. We keep records of our calls. Over my career, I've responded to more than 8,000 emergency situations, house fires, car accidents, medical emergencies, industrial accidents. How many people would you estimate you've helped save?" Oprah asked, understanding that sometimes the most important questions are the ones that force us to confront the good we've done alongside the pain we carry. Robert was quiet for a moment, thinking. Direct saves, where I personally pulled someone from immediate danger? Maybe 300 people. But counting medical interventions, fire suppression that prevented casualties, searches that located missing persons, probably thousands. The studio audience was beginning to understand the scope of what Robert was describing. This wasn't just someone who occasionally helped others. This was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to being present for other people's worst moments, to being the person who showed up when everything was falling apart. "Tell us about what it means to be a first responder," Oprah said, sensing that Robert needed to talk about the context of his service before he could address whatever pain had brought him to write that letter. Robert's face transformed slightly as he talked about his work. Despite everything, despite the weight he carried, his love for his job was evident in every word. When you're a firefighter, you become part of people's stories at the moment when their stories could end, he said, his voice growing stronger. You show up when someone's house is burning down, when they're trapped in a car, when their father is having a heart attack. You're not just fighting fires or providing medical care. You're preserving families, protecting futures, making sure that bad moments don't become last moments. That's a heavy responsibility, Oprah observed. It is, Robert agreed. But it's also a privilege. There's nothing like the feeling of handing someone back to their family, of knowing that because you showed up, because you did your job, children still have their parents. Parents still have their children. The studio was quiet, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere important, somewhere that would explain the pain that was so evident in Robert's posture. Robert, Oprah said gently, you wrote me a letter about someone you couldn't save. Tell us about that. That's when Robert's composure finally cracked. The professional calm that had carried him through 3 decades of emergency calls, the emotional control that had allowed him to function in crisis after crisis, shattered like glass hitting concrete. My son, he whispered, and the microphone barely picked up his voice. My son Danny. He was 17 years old. The camera caught the moment when Robert's grief became visible, when the weight he'd been carrying for 4 years finally had a name and a face that the audience could understand. Tell us about Danny, Oprah said softly, understanding that sometimes the most healing thing you can do for someone is simply ask them to remember love before you ask them to confront loss. Robert smiled through his tears, and for a moment the pain in his eyes was replaced by pure love. Danny was everything good in the world. He was smart, funny, kind to everyone he met. He played football, but he was gentle. He wanted to be a teacher. Said he wanted to help kids the way I helped families. He was proud of what you did, Oprah said, understanding the connection between a father's service and a son's desire to serve. So proud, Robert replied. He used to tell people his dad was a real-life superhero. When he was little, he would draw pictures of me in my gear, saving cats from trees and rescuing people from burning buildings. He never understood that I was just doing my job. The studio audience was beginning to sense where this story was heading, and the collective intake of breath was audible when Robert continued. 4 years ago, on a Tuesday night in March, I was on a call, a warehouse fire on the south side, big blaze that required multiple companies. We were there for 6 hours, fighting it from every angle, making sure it didn't spread to the residential area next door. Robert paused, his hands shaking slightly as he relived the timeline that had changed everything. While I was at that fire, saving a building that no one even lived in, there was another fire, a house fire in our neighborhood, electrical problem that started in the basement and spread fast. The studio was completely silent now, understanding exactly where this story was heading. Danny was home alone. He'd been studying for a chemistry test. The neighbors said they heard the smoke alarm, saw the flames, called 911. The first trucks arrived within 8 minutes, which is good response time. But the fire had spread faster than anyone expected. Robert stopped, unable to continue for a moment. Oprah reached over and took his hands, providing the human connection that sometimes makes the impossible possible to say. They found him in his bedroom, Robert finally whispered. The firefighters who responded said he'd been overcome by smoke. They tried everything, but it was too late. The audience gasped audibly, and several people in the front rows were openly crying. This wasn't just a story about loss. It was a story about the cruelest irony imaginable. Robert, Oprah said, her own voice thick with emotion. Where were you when you found out? Still at the warehouse, Robert replied. Still fighting a fire that ultimately didn't matter, in a building that was going to be demolished anyway. My captain pulled me aside around midnight and told me there had been an incident at my house, that I needed to get home immediately. What went through your mind in that moment? Robert looked up at the camera, speaking not just to Oprah but to every parent watching who had ever worried about their child's safety. "I knew," he said simply. "I knew before he even finished telling me. I had this sick feeling in my stomach, this understanding that while I was saving a building, I was losing my son." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. "The worst part," Robert continued, "is that I know those firefighters. The ones who responded to House, who tried to save Danny. They're good men, brave men, skilled men. They did everything right, but I keep thinking, if I had been there, if I hadn't been at that stupid warehouse fire, maybe I could have gotten to him faster. Maybe I could have—" He stopped, overwhelmed by a grief that was 4 years old but felt fresh as an open wound. "Maybe you could have what?" Oprah asked gently. "Maybe I could have saved my own son," Robert said, and the words seemed to tear something inside him as he spoke them. "I spent 30 years saving other people's children, and I couldn't save my own." That's when Oprah did something that demonstrated why she had become more than just a talk show host. She became a healer, a facilitator of truth and connection. "Robert," she said, "look at me. Do you think Danny would blame you for being at work that night?" Robert shook his head immediately. "No. Danny understood the job. He was proud of what I did." "Do you think Danny would want you to carry this guilt for the rest of your life?" Again, Robert shook his head. "No. Danny would want me to keep helping people. He would want me to remember that the work matters." "Then why?" Oprah asked with the gentle persistence that had helped thousands of people find healing. "Are you punishing yourself for doing exactly what Danny admired about you? Why are you treating your dedication to saving lives as if it were a betrayal of your son?" Robert stared at her, the question hitting him like a physical force. For 4 years he had carried the belief that his commitment to his job had cost him his son, but hearing it stated so directly, he began to see the flaw in that logic. "Because I wasn't there when he needed me most," Robert said, but his voice carried less conviction now. "You weren't there because you were being exactly the man Danny was proud to call his father," Oprah replied. "You weren't there because you were doing exactly the work that made Danny want to help people too." That's when something extraordinary began to happen. From the back of the audience, a voice called out, "Captain Thompson? Captain Robert Thompson, from Engine." The camera swung toward the voice, revealing a middle-aged Latina woman who was standing and staring at Robert with an expression of recognition and overwhelming gratitude. "Yes, ma'am," Robert replied, confused but recognizing something familiar in the woman's face. "My name is Maria Gonzalez," she said, beginning to move toward the front of the studio. "You saved my daughter Sophia 12 years ago. House fire on Ashland Avenue." Robert's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. Sophia, she was 6 years old, trapped on the second floor. "You carried her out through her bedroom window," Maria continued, tears streaming down her face as she reached the interview area. "She's 18 now, Captain Thompson. She's in college, studying to be a nurse, because she wants to help people the way you helped her." The reunion that followed was captured by every camera in the studio, but no technology could adequately record the magnitude of what was happening. A father who thought he had failed was being reminded of a child he had saved, a life he had preserved, but the miracles were just beginning. From another section of the audience, an elderly black man stood up. "Captain Thompson, it's James Washington. You pulled me out of my car after that accident on the Dan Ryan in 20." Then a young white woman, "Captain Thompson, you performed CPR on my father. He lived because of you." One by one, people throughout the audience began identifying themselves as lives Robert had touched, families he had saved, futures he had preserved. They had come to the show not knowing he would be there, drawn perhaps by the theme of everyday heroes or simply by chance. But now they were rising like testimony, each one representing a story of life preserved, hope restored, families kept whole. The studio audience watched in amazement as more than a dozen people made their way toward the front of the studio, each one calling out their name and their connection to this man who thought he was a failure. Captain Thompson, you saved my son from drowning. Captain Thompson, you cut me out of a car wreck. Captain Thompson, you delivered my baby when the ambulance couldn't get through traffic. Captain Thompson, you talked my daughter out of jumping from a bridge. Oprah watched in amazement as her studio transformed into something that transcended television. A reunion between a hero and the lives he had shaped. A gathering of people whose existence was a direct result of one man's dedication to saving others. Robert, Oprah said, her voice filled with wonder. Do you see what's happening here? These are Danny's brothers and sisters. These are the children you saved so they could grow up and have children of their own. Maria Gonzalez took charge with the natural leadership of someone who understood the weight of gratitude. Captain Thompson, she said, my daughter Sophia is here today. She wanted to meet the man who gave her a future. A young woman emerged from the audience, walking toward Robert with purpose and grace. Sophia Gonzalez was 18 years old, beautiful and confident, wearing scrubs that indicated she was already working in healthcare while pursuing her nursing degree. Captain Thompson, Sophia said, I don't remember you saving me. I was only 6. But I remember my mother crying every year on the anniversary of that fire. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. I remember her telling me that I was alive because a brave man ran into a burning building to carry me out. She paused, her voice growing stronger. I'm studying to be a nurse, because you showed me what it means to dedicate your life to saving others. When people ask me why I want to work in medicine, I tell them about the firefighter who gave me the chance to grow up and help people too. Robert stared at this young woman, this living embodiment of all the good that had come from his years of service, and felt something shift inside his chest. The weight he had carried for 4 years didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. The recognition that his son's death, while tragic and senseless, didn't negate the value of all the lives he had saved. James Washington, the man Robert had pulled from the car accident, stepped forward with his own testimony. Captain Thompson, after you saved me, I went home to my family and realized I'd been taking every day for granted. I started volunteering with at-risk youth, trying to be for other kids what you were for me that day. Someone who shows up when things look hopeless. The young woman, whose father had received CPR, spoke next. My dad lived for 5 more years after you saved him. 5 years where he got to walk me down the aisle, meet his grandchildren, see his family whole and happy. Those 5 years exist because of you. One by one, Robert's saves shared not just their own stories, but the ripple effects of their survival. Children who existed because their parents had lived. Careers dedicated to service inspired by witnessing heroism. Communities strengthened by people who understood the value of showing up for others. Robert, Oprah said, as the testimonials continued. Danny may not have lived to grow up and become a teacher. But look around this studio. These people are teaching their children, their communities, their families about courage and service. Because you saved them. Danny's dream of helping people is alive in every life you preserve. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, whom Robert had rescued from an industrial accident 8 years earlier, spoke for all of them. Captain Thompson, you didn't just save our lives. You saved our futures, our families, our ability to contribute to the world. Danny would be proud to know that his father's work has touched thousands of lives, that his legacy lives on in every person you've helped. The show continued for another 40 minutes, with save after save sharing specific memories of how Robert had impacted their lives. They talked about the calm confidence he projected in crisis, the way he made everyone feel safe even in the most dangerous situations, the professionalism and compassion that characterized every interaction. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Oprah asked Robert how he felt after hearing from so many of the lives he had touched. I feel like I understand something I'd forgotten, Robert said, his voice steady for the first time since the conversation began. Danny used to say I was a superhero. But superheroes don't save everyone. They just show up and do their best with the time and tools they have. He looked around the studio at the faces of people he had helped, people who had built lives and families and careers because he had been there on their worst days. I couldn't save Danny, and that will always break my heart, he continued. But I saved Sophia, and James, and Michael, and all these other people. I can't let my grief over the one life I couldn't save make me forget about all the lives I did save. The studio audience rose to their feet in applause that wasn't just appreciation for a touching moment, but celebration of a man rediscovering his own worth, a hero remembering why he became a hero in the first place. Oprah stood and addressed the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today is the true meaning of heroism. It's not about being perfect or saving everyone. It's about showing up, doing your best, and understanding that even when we experience devastating loss, the good we've done in the world continues to matter. The episode ended with Robert surrounded by the lives he had saved, all of them now successful adults who had gathered around the man who had given them the gift of tomorrow. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Sofia Gonzalez presented Robert with a gift from all of his saves, a photo album containing pictures of their families, their children, their achievements, their lives lived fully because he had preserved them. This is Danny's legacy too, Sophia told Robert as he flipped through pages of weddings and graduations and baby pictures and career achievements. Every person in this album exists because you saved their parent or grandparent. Every achievement, every moment of joy, every contribution to the world. Danny is part of all of it through you. The show aired 8 weeks later, and the response was unprecedented. The Chicago Fire Department reported a surge in applications from people inspired by Robert's story. Fire departments across the country began implementing better mental health support for first responders dealing with traumatic loss. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Robert himself. 6 months after the show aired, he sent Oprah a letter written on fire department letterhead. "Dear Oprah," he wrote in his careful handwriting, "I wanted you to know that what happened on your show didn't just help me process my grief. It helped me remember why I became a firefighter in the first place." He described how the experience had reconnected him with his sense of purpose, how he had been able to return to work with renewed dedication rather than the guilt and doubt that had plagued him for 4 years. Several of the people who had spoken at the show had stayed in touch, creating a network of support that extended far beyond that single day in the studio. Most importantly, Robert wrote, "I've started talking to other first responders about loss and grief, and the weight of carrying other people's safety. Your show helped me understand that hiding our pain doesn't make us stronger. Sharing it does." A year later, Robert was featured in a follow-up episode of The Oprah Winfrey Show. He appeared not as someone seeking healing, but as someone offering it to others. He had started a support group for first responders who had experienced traumatic loss, and had become an advocate for mental health resources in fire departments nationwide. "The most beautiful thing about Danny's story," Robert told Oprah during his return visit, "is that it's inspired other first responders to keep serving even after experiencing loss. We've learned that honoring our loved ones doesn't mean carrying guilt. It means continuing to do the work they were proud of us for doing." Sofia Gonzalez appeared on the follow-up show as well, now a registered nurse working in pediatric emergency medicine. She wore a small pin on her scrubs, a firefighter's helmet with the number 17, Danny's age when he died. "Captain Thompson saved my life when I was 6, she told Oprah. "But Danny inspires my work every day. Every child I help, every family I comfort, I think about how this is what Danny would have wanted, for his father's heroism to keep rippling outward, creating more heroes." 5 years later, Robert Thompson, now 60 and still serving as a fire captain, has helped save over 200 additional lives since that day on The Oprah Winfrey Show. He has spoken at fire academies across the country, sharing not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about processing loss and finding meaning in service. The support group he started has helped over 300 first responders and has created a model that has been replicated in departments nationwide. More importantly, It has normalized conversations about grief and mental health in professions that traditionally discouraged emotional vulnerability. I learned that grief and purpose aren't opposites, Robert reflects. They can coexist. I will always grieve Danny, but I can grieve him while still honoring what he admired about me. I can miss my son while still being grateful for the opportunity to be a father figure to every person I helped save. Every year on the anniversary of Danny's death, Robert visits his son's grave with Sophia, James, Michael, and several others from that day at the studio. They share stories about their lives, their families, their contributions to their communities, all the things that exist because Robert showed up on their worst days. Danny, Robert says each year, standing at his son's headstone, surrounded by the lives he serves, your dad is still a superhero. Not because I save everyone, but because I keep showing up to try. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about preventing all loss, but about finding meaning in the midst of loss. Sometimes heroism isn't about being perfect, but about continuing to serve even when service costs us everything. And sometimes the greatest tribute to the ones we couldn't save is refusing to let their loss stop us from saving others. The question isn't whether we can save everyone. The question is whether we'll keep showing up, keep trying, keep believing that every life preserved creates ripples of good that extend far beyond what we can see. Robert Thompson learned that lesson in a television studio, surrounded by proof that even heroes who lose everything still have something infinitely valuable to give.